Okay, well, thank you, Nadav Eyal. Welcome to Australia. Welcome to Sydney. It's a great pleasure to host you on our AIJAC events channel with
Thank
YouTube.
You.
And for those who don't know, Nadav Eyal is one of Israel's most prominent journalists. He's a winner of the Sokolov Award, and he writes for Yediot Ahronot and Ynet, and he serves as a commentator on Channel 12. He's reported extensively on the war in Gaza and the northern border since October the 7th, covering events from the field, providing insight and analysis, and especially the human impact of the conflict. He's also a regular on Call Me Back, which most of us, many people in Australia listen to in the Jewish community, and has given us lots of information. He's also the author of Revolt, the worldwide uprising against globalization. And throughout his career, he's covered Israel's politics, he's covered the Middle East, and Washington-Jerusalem relations, interviewing multiple Israeli prime ministers and foreign leaders. And he's living at the moment in the United States at Columbia for a sabbatical year, I'll call it. So
Okay.
welcome. And with
Thanks,
that,
Paul.
perhaps maybe start on a personal note before we dive in. But what does it feel like to be a Jew and a prominent Israeli at the moment at Columbia University, and in America in general? And how does it compare with being an Israeli or life in Israel? Obviously, they're opposite ends of the spectrum and bring about different things. I'd be interested in your perspective on it.
Yeah, well, the reason I came to Colombia, Paul, is really because it became such an interesting place. And I'm a journalist. I like to be in interesting places. And the person approaching me is the dean of SIPA, the School of International Public Affairs of Columbia University, Karen Yarhi-Milo, who herself was born in Israel and grew up in Israel. And she felt that there is not enough teaching about the Middle East in general in SIPA, and specifically, for instance, on the peace process and the conflict. And it was a subject that was somehow kind of, I don't want to say ignored, but it was seen as too explosive. And she turned to me right after October 7. I said, no, I'm covering the war. And then stuff started happening in Colombia. And she turned to me again after almost a year, and I said, "Now I'm willing to consider it." And to your question, how it is? First of all, it's interesting, but not in the sense of, the demonstrations. And I think, to some extent, this is getting a lot of coverage. But when you are actually in Colombia, there are like 25 lawns in Colombia, and there might be half a lawn in which once a week you would see a demonstration there. I think I'm a bit exaggerating by once a week. Mostly it's my interaction with students that is extremely, thought-provoking. And
Are they mainly Jewish students, or?
so I have many Jewish students, I guess. I'm not asking students for their religion, but I also have had students that come from countries that don't necessarily have relations with the country I come from as an Israeli journalist. And what I experienced is truly an interaction. People coming to study. People who have completely different opinions as to the conflict sometimes. I have had students who wrote to me papers that were extremely supportive of, say, the US and Israeli position in the region. Students who are writing extremely critical papers about that. It's an interesting sensation to speak with a student that comes from a country that doesn't have diplomatic relations with Israel, that has a stamp in the passport saying valid for every country besides Israel, that tells you, hey, I didn't know that fact. And this is what I'm about in Colombia. This is what I believe in. I didn't come to Columbia University to do advocacy. I'm a journalist. I don't do advocacy. I came to have this true kind
Unless you're a journalist in Australia.
Okay,
that's a controversy.
And but that's against Israel, right?
Yeah.
From what I hear. No, I'm just joking. The idea was to have the true academic discussion aim of teaching people how to think about problems using facts. deliberating through facts. And what I'm seeing is that beyond the noise, most of the students are still extremely, attracted to that. They know that they'll have, a better understanding, a better education, and a better job afterwards if they actually do that. And it doesn't matter if they come from countries that like the professor's nationality or it doesn't. So for me, it was really mind-opening in that sense, and until now, a very positive experience of interaction.
Well, perhaps from that personal maybe segue into relations with the West generally. Israel, Australia, use Australia as a proxy. We're suffering in Australia as a Jewish community from a sort of real jarring of where things were years ago. There's been a rise in antisemitism. We struggle to understand how to deal with the progressive left. We have a government whose positions have increasingly distanced themselves from Israel. We obviously had a blow up in the last couple of weeks with between our prime ministers. We've had the Iranian ambassador expelled. So these are tumultuous times, but Australia, as I said, is kind of like a proxy for these other like-minded nations of Canada, France, the UK. And I think in many ways different from the United States, at least because at the moment you have the Trump administration. Although, if the New York elections coming up are a guide, perhaps that's only a matter of time until things become more like Australia. So how are these strained relations sort of affecting Israel's view of the world? Is it really just focused on that narrow strip of lawn at the White House? Can they see beyond it? To us, it feels quite alarming that there's this real divide starting to happen. How do you think Israelis are sort of thinking about it and dealing with it?
So I think, first of all, that Israelis are very attentive right now to the war. And this is an understatement. The war controls the news cycle and the attention to 90% of what you're thinking about during the day. If you're thinking about stuff that isn't concerning your family and your job, is usually about the war. Anti-Semitism rising around the world, specifically in Australia, is getting quite a lot of coverage. But it doesn't go to the depths of the reasons, the different parties. What's happening within the Australian society that is enabling this kind of what seems to be hostility towards Israel? Is it all because of the war in Gaza, or did the war in Gaza unleash something that was there just waiting, lurking to explode? And these are questions, Paul, that frankly, you know the answer better than me, and definitely better than most Israelis. I do think, and this is one of the things that I keep on writing about, that Israel is at a crossroads, internationally speaking, and that it simply cannot afford itself to become a complete pariah. So it doesn't really matter if you think that what's happening right now in Gaza, what the Israelis are doing is completely justified, or it is less so. Israel and Israeli leadership needs to take into account the world in its decisions. And I think that Israel's founding fathers sort of understood this, and they were very attentive to, what the UN would say. So Ben-Gurion said, shmum, the UN is nothing, okay? But, if the UN would have decided, Security Council decided that, skirmishes on the Egyptian border will stop at 2 p.m., they did stop at 2 p.m. And part of it is because Israel was always a very global nation. People came from all over the world. And part of it is because it's such a small nation. And Israelis understood that they cannot only rely on the US. And by the way, when the country, at the inception, they didn't only rely on the US. They didn't get, for instance, Israel didn't get its arms from the US for many years. So I think that this is, to some extent, an inflection point. Right now, it's not positive for Israel around the world. And the people paying the price are diaspora Jews that support Israel. Israel wants these Jewish communities to support it. On the one hand, when they support it, they are the lightning rods, that are being accused by those who are critical of Israel. And there's a lot of anti-Semitism going there. So every Jew is responsible for all the bad deeds, as they see it, of those attacking Israel. And I think it's an incredibly important moment for the Jewish people. It's important that we Israelis, and I'm self-criticizing now, take much more time, devote much more time to talking about it, and for our leadership to really address it.
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly just crystallized things in a way that were, in all respects, the relations between Israel and Australia, about what's going on in this place. I think most of us are not naive enough to think that it just happened because of the Gaza war. It didn't. It's been here for a long time. But the way in which it's manifested itself has been alarming and probably surprising to most people, even though that we thought that. I'd be interested to, you've got a little bit of a sense of it from us about what's going on in Australia. And Australia, unfortunately, for all the wrong reasons, has been in the paper because of it. I'd be interested to hear what it's like in the US. You spoke briefly about Colombia, but the political environment generally, as an outsider, it obviously feels like America is different to Australia and France and Canada. There are probably a number of factors as to why, but I'm interested in if there's a comparison that can be made.
So first of all, America is as you know, is a big place, and so making generalizations about the US is always a mistake. You can find everything, and you can definitely find the stream of thought that sees Israel as completely as illegitimate, stemming from usually progressive leftist or radical leftist ideas, delegitimizing Israel's right to exist simply because it is seen as sort of a vector for every sins made in the West, settler colonialism, through ethnic cleansing, to now genocide. So you can definitely see that, and you can definitely see this, for instance, in New York in general.
Yeah.
And the person who's leading the race in New York, Mondani, is definitely holding to these views, or to views that echo these views. And on the other hand, in the US, you have a very strong base of support to Israel that goes much beyond the Jewish community in the US. That is of itself, in terms of the sheer number of it, much more crucial than any other Jewish community in the world that isn't in Israel. But I'm talking about devout Christian communities that feel attached to Israel, but also a sense of Americanism. People who, Jewish communities swear allegiance in their community schools. Their allegiance to the country is essential. They're American patriots. And it's true for every Jewish diaspora. I know it's true for the Australian Jewish diaspora too. But it also relates to specific populations in America that don't live on the coast, on the east or west coast, but in what some people would have labeled before the flyover country, right? These vast areas that are truly America, between San Francisco and New York. And in these areas, Israel still stands for many people for what is right and for the good judgment of history. And they see Israel as an important ally. And President Trump, with Make America Great Again movement, is really representative of these people. Now, this too is being fractured. On some parts of American far-right, but also in American right-wing populists, you see some people, turning more to criticism of Israel that sounds either like radical lefty sometimes, or sometimes it plays with, I would say, echoes of anti-Semitism. So you're seeing these things happening. But still, it's not the mainstream. And by the way, it's also not the mainstream of the Democratic Party, I should say. This erosion of Israeli status is happening also in the US. I'm just talking based on polls.
But maybe not as pronounced.
Not as pronounced, and also things take much more time in America to happen. America moves much more slowly than, young, smaller nations like, for instance, Australia. And I think that conservatism in America is the most entrenched of any Western country in the world for many, many reasons.
Yeah. How do you, you may have an observation, how do you think the American administration is really responding to this move, basically, by its traditional allies in another direction?
You mean
Australia, Canada, France?
Well,
how bad is it for the relations between America, the bilateral relations between America and those countries? I'm talking obviously about Australia.
I think that first of all, we're seeing already reactions, and a good example is, of course, the sanctions coming from the U.S. as to the ICC. The current administration in the U.S. really hates this direction. And its credence within the American public is resisting these nations turning into sort of, I'm not talking specifically about Australia right now, but nations turning into hubs of what they see as progressive, radical leftism. So it's good for them politically to resist it, but they also ideologically are willing to have punitive means against it. I think it definitely strains the relations. But the other question is, to what extent will the US be willing to somehow damage its relations because of other countries' opinions of Israel? And, the honest answer is, I don't think so. I don't think that for the Americans, it makes sense to damage relations only because of that. But if it comes as a set of values that is very different.
It's contributing,
of what they label as the woke culture, or wokeism. This is something they're allergic to. One only has to hear one interview by, J.D. Vance, the vice president, to understand that this is really about mounting a very argumented opposition, a well-based opposition as far as the Israeli as far as the American right wing is seeing it, to what they label as wokeism, and they're committed to it. This is not a PR stunt. This is not only to garner some votes or have engagement on social networks. They see themselves as representatives of what President Trump calls the working man of America, who wants to bring common sense back. And this has many, many different segments in it, right? Rejection of American influence will cause them to respond. Somehow a feeling that people are not showing enough gratitude to American defense, defending the Western Hemisphere or its allies, will also sort of trigger this kind of response. Having policies that affect American companies in a way that the administration will see as unfair, and also attacking Israel or condemning Israel or recognizing Palestinian statehood. So I suspect that the US will react to that, to countries who are actually going to recognize with Palestinian statehood. Will they go into, really damaging the relations with, for instance, with Australia? I don't think so. But I don't know. This is going to be a touch and go decision by President Trump. And as you know, the president takes these decisions sometimes extremely quickly.
Yeah. Just while we're on, just to finish up with this topic, there has been the view, I think, held that Israel always suffers during these wars. That's why, Ben Gurion talked about Israel needs to have short wars, I think. So there's always been the view that, things go terribly in wars but afterwards everyone kind of forgets. Is that going to happen this time, or is the genie out of the bottle? And all these trends of, lawfare and sanctions and boycotts and, frankly, this, set of blood libels. How permanent is it? Can we can Israel dig itself out of this hole at the end of this war?
So I think this time it's different, unfortunately, and I think we're in for a decades long of repercussions of the Gaza war to the Israeli standing in the world. I think it's different because of several reasons, but basically the base for delegitimizing Israel has been built for decades over decades. And it exploded during the Gaza war specifically because everything was ready to make this argument against Israel. It didn't matter that Hamas invaded Israel and began its own ethnic cleansing against Israeli civilians. And you see this is not me sort of interpreting, but you see the reactions on October 8, right? On October 9, you see people organizing demonstrations for Gaza on October 10, right? This was before the Israelis managed to even do something. In response, they were still counting the bodies. So I think this is an important moment. It's a very challenging moment for Israeli legitimacy around the world, not only with sort of center-left elites. According to the polls I'm seeing, this is also penetrating, for instance, some centrist right in the US. And it will demand of Israel to, first of all, as a journalist, I should say, always, self-criticize yourself and your actions before you think about PR, before you think about how it radiates, to think about the actions it did, to think about the results of these actions, and to have this internal process. One of the things I keep saying, and I don't think I invented it, many countries in the world have their different sins of history, but only one country is being indicted, and the court of these specific groups or elites needs not to exist as a result of these alleged, underlining the word alleged sins. And that country is Israel. Now, this singling out can only be explained by an obsession of the Jewish state and to some extent of anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I think you've sort of summed. Maybe just, I wouldn't mind connecting your book.
Yeah.
Because you wrote it before the war, obviously, but you wrote about the global backlash against globalization and fragility of democracies. So now with the perspective of the war and kind of where we are, and Israel's current challenges that we've been speaking about, external threats, but really internal threats, what do you think the one main lesson you would, from that work that you would focus on in the current moment?
So,
and that is being urgent for Israel.
So my book, I think, appeared in English in 2021, and my main remark is about political sentiment. In politics, sentiment is the most important thing. And the political sentiment that we're seeing around the world for more than a decade now is a sentiment that I label revolt. The revolt is widespread, leaderless, and it has the potential to unite, I write in the book, different groups that come from different extremes, far right, far left, sometimes even environmental radical groups and others, anti-vaxxers, charlatans, many people who feel that the system isn't working for them. And one of the things that the book is saying is that I don't justify, definitely not.
They agree on one thing.
Yeah, okay. They agree.
Israel.
Yeah. To some extent, they agree on. They can unite. Fundamentalist Islamists, radical leftists. By the way, leftism in general, unlike radical fundamentalist Islamism and far right white supremacy Nazis, left as of itself has no ideological DNA of rejection of Judaism or Israel. However, it has developed. And what you see here is this sentiment of a revolt against power structures wherever they are, and against the idea of power structures as it was enshrined by the West, and the concept of the West as being a contaminated term in terms of civilization. Everything is built on slavery, so everything is wrong, or everything was built on abuse of power and capitalism and so forth and so forth. And there, I think that what we're seeing in the Gaza war is that it allows all these sides to unite, as you said, Paul, around hating what Israel is doing. Now, after I say that, it doesn't mean that all the criticisms against Israel are not warranted. It doesn't mean that Israel has been right through the war, or that, for instance, innocent civilians have not died in Gaza. And one of the things that we should be worried about, or I'm worried about as Israeli, is not to become so entrenched in a defensive position that I can't do the most important thing for democracy and for Israel as a democracy, and that is look inwards. Even if you're attacked, look inwards and ask yourself, what is true, even if you're indicted unjustly, what is true in the criticisms that you can level against yourself? This is the real defense of Israel. It's not only about patriotism, it's also about the idea of Israel as a republic, as a liberal country, as a democracy. This is what gives it strength. And I hope we didn't forget that during the war in Gaza. And I suspect that some Israelis did forget that during the war in Gaza. And I write about this extensively.
Seek the truth.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah.
And let's sort of maybe just finish off then. I mean, come back to the war. It's obviously at a highly, important juncture. How's it going to end? Is it going to end? And rather than ask for your prediction and the on it, because by the time we broadcast this, something would have happened.
Yeah.
That would have changed.
Yeah.
I mean, Israel. Let's frame it this way: Israel has had these impossible, contradictory war aims. Get back the hostages. Defeat Hamas. It kind of feels like the government has been still spouting these contradictory aims, but has really moved towards we have to defeat Hamas.
Yeah.
Is that what's happening? Is that really the way to see this? Because to think that both of those things are going to be achieved, I think almost anyone sensible would say it's actually not possible anymore.
Yeah.
But I understand why the government can't say that. But is that what's really happening? And is that how this is actually going to sort of come to an end? However compromised that ending is.
Yeah, that's a big question. But here's the sort of a shorter version of an answer. These two goals of the war cannot be achieved at once, at the same time, simultaneously, but they could be achieved. The question is, how do you prioritize? And the argument of not only the family of the hostages, but also of the defense apparatus in Israel, the IDF right now, is the hostages don't have time. But Israel is a strong country. If it wants to take out Hamas completely in Gaza, it has eternity to do so. But the hostages are dying. And so I would say, okay, but these are 20 people. You need to think about the fate of the nation. You need to think about the future. And to that, I counter that getting the hostages back is not about being sentimental. It's about the idea that in a very difficult neighborhood in which Israel exists, there is a vision of Israel that you're fighting for. And that vision is of solidarity. And it is important, again, not because of ideals, but also because of self-interest. And the self-interest is that people will know that bad things can happen, but the country will do everything to get them out. The meaning of everything is really everything. Now, nobody is talking about surrendering, parts of Israel to Hamas in order to get the hostages. So when people say everything, they don't mean everything, but they do mean everything that is plausible, that is reasonable. And getting a deal now and getting as many hostages as you can now is not only plausible and reasonable because you want to preserve the self-interest of this solidarity, because you want soldiers to be fighting for it, because you want their families to know that if something happens to them, the country will do what it needs to do to get them back. But it's also important because if you actually look at the map of Gaza today, and you're asking yourself, why isn't the IDF here and here and here? And I can go from place to place. It's because the IDF suspects that in this neighborhood or this area, there are hostages. So this actually limits what the IDF can do in Gaza to Hamas, simply because the hostages are still there. So if you want to take out Hamas, the first thing you want to do is to get the hostages. Now, there's another possibility. The chief of staff told the government this. It wasn't on the record, but was in a government meeting. Very interesting. He said, if you want me to do this, I'm asking you, take out the goal of getting the hostages back from the goals of the war. Mm. If you're ordering the IDF, this is not a declaration. You're ordering the IDF that there are two goals of this war, and you want me to do this, that would mean the hostages would die. So, and I cannot supplement for that goal. If they'll die, it's over. And because of that, I think that the Israeli defense mechanisms and the professionals that deal with negotiations with Hamas, the IDF, who's fighting Hamas, are making a very strong argument within the Israeli public right now to get the deal now. And they were saying there is a deal on the table. It's not a good deal. Any deal with Hamas is not a good deal. It's not a perfect deal, but it's what you can get right now, and then deal with Hamas later. And to some extent, I think, or really frankly, that if Israel would have done that when the IDF started saying that, which was more than a year ago, they started saying that in March of 24. 4 months after the IDF entered the Gaza Strip, they said, let's finish this, get a deal, get all the hostages out, move to the north, take out Hezbollah. The war would have been shorter. Israel's legitimacy in the world would have been not intact, but much stronger than it is today. Many lives would have been saved in the war in Gaza, of innocent lives of the population in Gaza, and the hostages would be back home, and Israel would have been already in a position in which it could turn again to try and damage the Hamas rule in the Gaza Strip. And now it can't do that anymore. So it's a very complex situation. Now, to be fair with this, can also hear the argument saying, if you take the deal now, you only get 10 hostages back out of 20.
You can't breathe.
Hamas is maintained in the Gaza Strip, and they have 10 hostages. I'm hearing those arguments, and I think they're, you should hear those arguments rationally. But right now, what I'm seeing in front of my eyes are the images of the hostages in the tunnels, and the reason that this state was born. There is no Jew alive that has suffered as much as these hostages since Jews were released from the death camps in Poland. We need to get them out and then restructure, rethink how we get to defeating the Hamas military, which is a legitimate target still.
Well, on that note, let's hope and pray that happens. And thank you very much for your time today. It's been
Thanks very much.
Pleasure speaking to you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.